Thank you very much for inviting me and turning out on a wet night for this very, very important issue. I'm going to start by taking a moment to think, how should we deal with the environment? The environment is both a shared resource, global, it's local. We all have aspects of it that we care about most. It's absolutely clear that its management is fundamental to our future, and more of the environmental issues we worry about, climate warming, the future of the oceans, the decline of biodiversity, have a strong global dimension as well as a very local one. The way we've gone about it in trying to address these issues of trying to get a handle on the environment, trying to manage it the right way, try to make the right trade-offs between economic concerns, social concerns, environmental concerns, has been to add a pretty large layer of European policy on top of what was already quite a developed and quite locally focused in many ways set of policies in the UK. So we've embarked since the 1970s on a major cooperative effort between countries, with the European institutions as well, to construct environmental policies right across the piece, from waste policy to climate policy, to biodiversity, to water pollution, to air pollution, and so forth. There's not many things it doesn't cover, and it's probably the most comprehensive set of environmental policies in the world, influencing quite a few countries elsewhere as well. And this has been done at the time when the EU emerged as an important entity, both in terms of the economy and the polity and the governance of Europe. So it was not surprising that a lot of this effort was done at a European level. And what we've ended up with, therefore, is on the UK statutes, a lot of measures which depend very heavily on EU law and EU directives. And these are complemented and closely intermingled with exclusively UK measures. So we've got an absolute mélange of different measures, and disentangling them would not be that easy, which everybody who works on this agrees. That's one thing that everyone does agree on. So why do environmental policy at a collective level and a European level? Why bother? Well, in principle, there are a number of reasons why you might want to bother. Firstly, because a number of issues, not all of them, are trans-frontier, they cross borders, air pollution, climate, good examples. Secondly, we're dealing with a fair number of common resources, like fish, like other aspects of the ocean, where different countries have got not only historic rights, but a legitimate interest in this. Thirdly, and in fact in the EU, this has been an incredibly important driver, is the single market. If we have what's now 28 countries working together, then you want, as an investor, to have some idea that there's a level playing field, that one country isn't undermining the competitiveness of its neighbors by adopting lower standards. Now, that's clearly something which has driven a lot of EU policy, particularly on product standards for cars, for white goods, and so forth. Then there's the whole question of what is your leverage on the world stage. And under some views of the world, you could say that the UK on its own traditionally has had greater leverage than being part of the EU. I think the collective view of a lot of academics now, and then politicians may or may not agree, is that on the whole, the EU as a whole has established greater leverage on the world stage than individual countries on environmental issues, and that's been particularly true on climate, although that's certainly declining now. But of course, you do pay a penalty for that your view is diluted by the views of others. You're working in a collective framework. Then there's the question of the aspects of the environment which are extremely technical and demanding to regulate. A good example here has been chemicals. The regulation of chemicals is an expensive business, and involving a lot of bureaucracy, of testing and organization. And in terms of efficiency, there are really sort of two competing world models. One is the US world model, and the other is the EU world model. And to set up your own system of regulating chemicals totally outside that system would be an expensive way to go. And then in the political realm, what we've seen in Europe, and I was quite surprised by this, to be honest, is the degree to which countries have been willing to adopt a more ambitious agenda, working together than on their own. So when we had the experience in 2004 of 10 new countries joining the EU from Central and Eastern Europe mostly, and then 2 more a little bit later, the general expectation was that they would lower standards, they would seek to reduce environmental standards in Europe. And there's certainly been some tensions, but on the whole, they haven't sought to do that. And I think the explanation for that is that most governments are much happier advancing on environmental goals, which tend to entail short-term costs in order to get to the place you want to be in the long term. And looking at that trade-off, they're much happier to do that as part of a club than on their own. And it's been quite surprising that Central and Eastern European countries, in a way, have been perfectly happy to be part of that club. So I think that's one of the reasons that EU environmental policy has proceeded the way it has. And the final thing I'd like to mention is the EU focus on the long term. It's much easier in the EU, partly because of its relatively slow-moving systems, to establish long-term targets, to take a long time to negotiate them, and then to try to stick with them. And it's not a very supple system. It's quite hard to revise measures once they're in place. It takes a long time to negotiate them, and that's one of the drawbacks of the whole system. But once it's there, you can progress bit by bit. And this is very clear in the green economy. You know which direction you're going in, and you can do some backcasting from EU targets. And this gives one some sense of certainty, and investors will make their own views as to how much they believe in these targets and how far this direction travels. But most of them are inclined to believe the collective EU approach more than the single government approach, partly because it's just much harder to change. So there are downsides to this, one of which is that it's a club. You don't always like your fellow members of a club. You get arguments. You won't always have your own issues at the top of the agenda. You might have to wait for a long time for that to come round. It won't always be as supple as you'd ideally like. And you won't always have your particular domestic issue at the front of the agenda. There are transaction costs for doing things at a European level. I don't think anyone who's involved in EU environment policy, as I am, would regard it as nirvana. It just is a machine which has produced a large amount of legislation and a clear direction of change. So that's the theory. In practice, a couple of points worth making about that. In establishing a pretty comprehensive policy, I think we've seen success in most areas in environmental terms in respect to outcomes: less water pollution, less air pollution, less waste generation, cleaner water, cleaner seas. Sometimes that's been pretty slow. We see in the common agricultural policy and the common fisheries policy, for example, extremely slow processes of trying to green large-scale incentive schemes, which has been done bit by bit. Certainly one can argue how far you've got on that. The result of all this has been increase in environmental standards in the UK against the trajectory we would have had before, and certainly academics in various studies are pretty generally agreed on that point. And the other thing that's happened is that administrations have tended to make sure that they do comply with EU legislation up to a point anyway, because of the fear of penalties if they don't. So there is a a cost for failure to comply. And in some cases, countries, including the UK, end up in the European Court with a penalty. So ministers, when they arrive, see that they get advice from their civil servants saying, well, if we don't implement this measure, there is a risk involved. You may end up in the court, you may. So EU measures tend to get implemented. And that's one reason why a lot of people in the environmental community tend to support them, because they're more confident they're going to get implemented than purely domestic ones. So what happens if we come out of the EU? Can I have my... yeah. We've tried in a report to simplify this into two big scenarios. One scenario is that the UK comes out of the EU and joins the European Economic Area, and that's a bit of a process. It's roughly the Norway example. And you'll see in there the downside of that is that you have to comply with most EU legislation, but you don't have a role in making the legislation. There's a couple of exceptions of rules that won't apply, but the great majority of EU legislation would continue to apply. And then there's the second scenario, which is coming out of the EU and out of the EEA, in which nearly all EU legislation fails to apply unless you're exporting into the EU market. And under this scenario, a future government could change EU policy quite considerably. Possibly over time, they could establish completely different standards, provided they were taking account of the need to export to the EU. So on the second scenario, the UK is in a much more free trade situation and will be more motivated to lower standards potentially in order to get competitive advantage than it would be under the first scenario where it's part of the EEA. But in either case, it obviously doesn't have the ability to influence EU policy, and it would be an independent actor in global agreements like climate change and so forth. So those are the two different kinds of scenarios. And in the debate on Brexit, some people advocate being part of the EEA. I think probably more people advocate being outside the EEA. So those are some of the questions I think it's helpful to ask when people are talking about, okay, well, what do we mean? And then you can ask yourself, well, how would a future government would be free to do what it liked, obviously, how would it behave? And then you have to ask yourself, how would it behave in relation to these parameters? So I'll stop there.